So, you know how I said I was only going to talk about bands I hate this month? That was a lie, because today I'm going to be talking about the Cranberries, which is a band that I don't hate at all. I actually think they're quite good, even remarkable in certain respects. But I didn't always feel this way until fairly recently, and that's totally on me. I don't have a good reason or even excuse for sleeping on them for as long as I did. All I can really do is chalk it up to laziness and ignorance on my part. You know how sometimes you hear a band's biggest hit song and you really like it, but the downside is it gives you a skewed idea of what that band actually is? That was what happened with me and Zombie. Yes, I'm one of those people. This actually happens to me a lot, unfortunately. Whatever my gateway is to appreciating a band, I tend to cling to that impression at the expense of enjoying or even understanding what they're doing the rest of the time. Whether I want to or not, I kind of expect everything they do to capture the same feel and effect, and if it doesn't, I tend to judge it rather unfairly. It's almost as if my methodology for listening to music is somewhat flawed. And it's especially jarring to go whole hog into a band's full catalog when their most famous song turns out to be largely unrepresentative of their sound as a whole. But all these years later, I feel like I finally gained a much better understanding of where the Cranberries were coming from and what they were doing. I had to learn a lot more of the context that I was missing and work on jettisoning some of my old biases, but overall I'd have to say the journey was worth it. It's just too bad I didn't get there before the tragic death of singer Dolores O'Riordan 1 year ago this day. But I guess things don't always happen the way they should. So here I am, the last person in the world to discover the music of the Cranberries only a few decades after everyone else has long since given them their praise and move on. And in a way, doesn't that make me the most qualified person to talk about them? The Cranberries are from Limerick, Ireland, and they actually formed as an all-male group in 1989, with original singer Niall Quinn under the name The Cranberries Saw Us. Niall left the band after only about 7 months to focus on his main project, The Hitchers, and the remaining members, brothers Noel and Mike Hogan on guitar and bass respectively, and drummer Fergal Lawler, put out an ad specifically looking for a female singer. Although according to the band's official bio, it was actually Niall himself who introduced Dolores to the band and was instrumental in arranging her audition. Apparently one of the first songs they all put together as a group was Linger, which the boys in the band were so impressed by what Dolores brought to the vocals and lyrics that they basically hired her right there on the spot when they heard it. Which, given the way things eventually turned out for them, smart move. Apparently there is an alternate version of the song that became Linger with Niall on vocals and a totally different melody and set of lyrics, but I wasn't able to find it. I have listened to some of the demos they recorded as the Cranberries Saw Us before Dolores joined the band, and I have to say, I don't think they ever would have broken through as big as they did without her. Niall is definitely not a bad singer, and you can see how his voice fits well with the style they were playing, a combination of lush, dream pop style, clean guitar jangle, and post-punk college rock in the vein of the Smiths. But the truth is, they don't start to sound like the Cranberries as we know them until Dolores starts singing their songs. Cause let me tell you something, Dolores was the kind of singer capable of changing a band's identity 100% just by showing up. She does not blend into the background. Her powerful projection, astonishing range, and let's say unusual sense of phrasing immediately establish her as the single most interesting element of the band's music. She became a star for a reason is what I'm saying. Before her, the band basically sounded like Echo and the Bunnymen, or the Psychedelic Furs, or The Church. With Dolores on vocals, all comparisons to anything else kind of go right out the window. The Cranberries' full-length debut album came out in 1993 after a string of independently released EPs, and it is alternative rock in the original sense, before the term got saddled with, let's say, certain Seattle-esque connotations. It's called Everybody Else Is Doing It, So Why Can't We, which is a misleading title because as far as I could tell, almost nobody was still doing this kind of music by 1993. All the bands that I compared their sound to earlier had their heyday in the early to mid-80s. And well, okay, stylistically similar bands like the Sundays and the Laws and even James were having crossover success in and around this time, but they were more on the fringes of the mainstream. Maybe you could have pointed to U2 as a reference point, but by then they had long since revamped their image and sound wholesale for Achtung Baby and Zooropa. They should have called the album We're the Only Ones Doing This, so check it out.
Do you have to let it linger? Do you have to?
Female-fronted bands were few and far between in the late 80s, early 90s mainstream rock, if not non-existent. That might be why they stood out so much initially, but far from being a gimmick, their debut immediately establishes that there's real substance in the songwriting too. All the songs are written by either Noel and Dolores or just Dolores herself, and their sensibilities line up more or less perfectly. There's just a strong sense of unity and chemistry throughout their entire roster of the band, like they've spent years playing together instead of being very, very new to this, which they actually were.
You know I'm such a fool for you. I know I've had like this before, but now I feel
I think this this might have been one of those lightning in a bottle things where the right band members just happen to find each other and it all comes together. Just think of how many great bands we missed out on simply because they never quite put together the perfect collection of individuals who could bring out the best in each other musically. Although it isn't as if it feels like Dolores is adjusting her style to her bandmates necessarily, more like it fits into what the band is doing in a way that seems unexpected, yet kind of perversely works better than it has any right to. One of the most unique identifying features of her voice is a technique she does called keening, which comes from the old Irish word for cry or weep, and is apparently a traditional vocal tic associated with mourning for the dead, and it also happens to be one of the sounds that banshees make in Irish folklore. So if you've ever detected a banshee-like quality to Dolores' vocals, you're not wrong. Turns out that was intentional. I always figured she was just doing some form of Irish yodeling, but the truth makes a whole lot more sense. If there's one aspect of this album that betrays the group's relative inexperience, it's the way that most of the songs land somewhere between the 2.5 to 3.5 minute range. Linger and Dreams, the two biggest singles, actually happen to be the two longest songs on the album, which is unusual. It seems like most of the time, the biggest pop hits tend to be the more concise and tightly constructed tracks from a band. But these songs take weird, uncommercial detours instead. Linger has a great arpeggiated guitar intro that has about zero to do with the rest of the song and seems to exist simply to make it more interesting. And Dreams has what I can only call these extended keening solos in place of an actual chorus. Everybody else was an anomaly in that it made the band a success in the United States before they broke through in their home country or in the UK. This resulted in the singles getting re-released in 1994 after blowing up on American college radio. Normally it happens the other way around. A band is supposed to get popular where they're from before crossing over. A better video maker than me would take the time to delve into the history of international pop charts and try to draw some kind of insight about cultural cross-pollination or changing tastes on either side of the pond. But good videos are not what this channel is about. Either way, we Yanks loved this band pretty much right away. It went platinum 5 times in the States. The Cranberries were well on their way to becoming one of the most iconic bands of the decade, which is a status they would firmly cement with their next release, No Need to Argue, in 1995. Okay, can we just talk about this hook? I mean, good lord, the sheer massiveness of that thing. That's the type of hook that makes a song an instant hit. It makes use of all the band's signature features as Dolores is keening all over the place in the chorus, while also upgrading their sound with a much heavier and more distorted guitar tone. The band is also now tackling the kinds of geopolitical social issues that were completely absent from the first album, which gives the song a real sense of urgency and longing for reconciliation. Something must be done, it says. But mostly that hook just gets it. Incidentally, No Need to Argue is the Cranberries' biggest selling album, with something like 17 million sold total. There's also another pretty big hit called Ode to My Family. I remember also liking this song, but as big as it was, it never stood a chance of becoming as inescapable as Zombie was. And this brings me back to my intro. As I mentioned, this song formed my entire impression of what the Cranberries were as a band, which turned out to be mistaken. If everybody else is doing it was an anomaly, standing out among the early 90s rock crowd for the way it actually hewed closer to dream pop and placed far more emphasis on sonic prettiness than its peers, Zombie is like the sound of that band taking a turn for dark, loud, and harsh. It's still recognizably the same band, but here it doesn't feel quite as out of step with the times. This is pretty much the platonic ideal of 1995 alternative rock. It's not exactly Cranberries going grungier, as the riffs still have more chime than crunch in them, but it's more transparently a mainstream bid than anything on their debut. And to be clear, this strategy absolutely worked, as it elevated them to the uppermost tier of the radio rock hierarchy. But in the long run, Zombie ended up setting an impossible peak of success they'd never quite reach again. And in particular, their follow-up album, 1996's To the Faithful Departed, was not nearly as well received. Common critical consensus at the time seemed to be that the Cranberries had finally sold out. After the success of Zombie, apparently they went all in on the distorted political protest rock, and in doing so they bit off a bit more than they could chew, and lost the magical alchemy that had made them seem like such a breath of fresh air in the first place. Now I can sort of understand why the critical backlash was so severe with this one, especially as it lacks any single knockout permanently in your head classic on the level of Zombie, but honestly I think it's a pretty good album on its own merits. At its best, it comes across as reminiscent of U2's 80s albums like The Unforgettable Fire or War, but with less dynamic production. It feels like that's the type of statement it was going for, but it's also laced with moments of traditional Cranberries-style dream pop, making for an interesting hybrid. Not all of it works by any means, but enough of it does that I can only consider the general panning the album got in outlets like Spin and Rolling Stone to be at least a little unfair.
Toward the mark he bore.
I guess what I like about this album is that parts of it remind me of Pink Floyd's The Final Cut, which was another critically underappreciated album from a major band who were coming off their biggest success. Not that you should ever go full Final Cut, but it's fascinating to me when a band decides to just lean into one element of their style at the expense of everything else, as if they are consciously attempting to define themselves as a particular type of artist. In this case, the era-defining capital I importance type. Look at these song titles: The Rebels, War Child, Bosnia, I Just Shot John Lennon. That's a posture that tends to rub people the wrong way if it doesn't succeed, but to me that very lack of success only makes the effort somehow even more charming. The Final Cut actually is an apt comparison in this case, since that album is generally considered more of a Roger Waters solo album than a Pink Floyd album proper, and To the Faithful Departed can basically be considered a glorified Dolores solo album, since she took over songwriting duties nearly unilaterally on it, with only 4 tracks having any input from Noel Hogan, whereas on previous releases their credits were split almost evenly. If you want an easy narrative, you can follow the band's evolution like this. Dolores wrote Zombie single-handedly, and it became by far the band's biggest single, and this success gave her the confidence and/or megalomania to take control of their musical direction going forward. But when that didn't work out, their 4th album, Bury the Hatchet, released in 1999, seemed to find the band retreating back into their original comfort zone, complete with increased songwriting collaboration between Noel and Dolores. The title, the cover, and the overall sound of the album almost reads like an apology to fans of the band who felt alienated by To the Faithful Departed. And yet, if anything, the response to this album was even more lukewarm than it had been to the previous one. By 1999, of course, alternative rock that didn't fit comfortably on either side of the great pop, punk, or new metal schism wasn't totally gone yet, but it was getting there. As we may have discovered once on this show, not a whole lot of stuff from the early 90s survived to the end of the decade. But even if popular trends hadn't shifted so much, it's unlikely that Bury the Hatchet would have won over a whole lot of new fans at this point. Back to Basics albums like this rarely do. Predictably, the best songs on it end up being the ones that remind you the most of the band's earlier releases. The songwriting is never truly bad, but it does at least register as some of the least interesting music they've produced so far. In the end, they close out the decade with a whimper, at least compared to the bang they had started it with.
Just my imagination, just my imagination.
The Cranberries announced their first breakup in 2003, following the previous year's release of a greatest hits compilation called Stars, the best of 1992 to 2002. Rumors of a Dolores O'Riordan solo career had been floating around since at least the time of No Need to Argue, and these finally came to fruition with the release of her first solo album, Are You Listening, in 2007. Noel Hogan played in the band's mono band and architect, as well as working as a producer for Supermodel Twins. Fergal Lawler joined the Low Network and worked with other bands in playing and production capacities. In 2009, the full lineup of the Cranberries officially reunited and embarked on their first tour together in years. Eventually, they released an all-new album, Roses, in 2012, and an acoustic self-covers album called Something Else in 2017. That same year, they had to cut their European tour short, citing health problems on the part of Dolores. When her recovery didn't advance quite as quickly as they would have liked, they also ended up canceling all their North American tour dates as well. Dolores O'Riordan was found dead of an accidental drowning on January 15th, 2018. 1 year ago this day, at the age of 46. The cause of death was found to be an accidental drowning in the bathtub due to sedation by alcohol intoxication. A deluxe 25th anniversary reissue of Everybody Else Is Doing It was pushed to later in the year due to this most untimely event, and eventually saw release on October 19th. The band also decided to finish the album they had been working on at the time of her death, for which she had already completed the recording of her vocals, and it is currently titled In the End and scheduled for release sometime in 2019. Almost assuredly, it'll be their swan song. The Cranberries brought Irish flavor, dream pop jangle, and vocals that were at once haunting, powerful, unique, and gorgeous to the genre of 90s alternative rock. They, and in particular their singer, deserve to be remembered as a group that made an undeniable mark on 90s music, without sacrificing their artistic integrity or glomming onto any trends. And in the 90s, that counted for a lot. I am Jacob, and this was Rad 90s Music. Rest in peace, Dolores O'Riordan.